Please welcome Alteryx CEO Mark Anderson and WestExec Managing Partner Michele Flournoy.
All right.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
First, I'd like to thank Victoria and the whole BSA team for putting on this event. It's a really important topic at just the right time. And today I have the good fortune of having a conversation with all of you and with Mark Anderson, the CEO of Alteryx. So, Mark, you've been CEO of Alteryx for about 2 years.
Yep.
But you also had a very long and successful career in the industry at companies like Palo Alto Networks, F5, and Cisco, just to name a few. But a little known fact is that Mark was born in Northern Ireland, grew up in Canada, and I learned just before this was a professional hockey player for a time, but is not at the typical profile of a CEO of a tech firm. So,
well, the fake teeth usually are, right? Yeah.
So I'd love to just know a little bit start with your personal journey and how did you go from Northern Ireland to being CEO of Alteryx?
Wow, that's a long story, but my dad, we came from the wrong side of the tracks, I guess, in Northern Ireland in Belfast, and back then the men didn't really live much into their 30s. My dad's dad died when my dad was 12, so my father went to night school for 12 years, married my mom, and got a degree at Queen's University in Belfast, and he got 2 job offers, one from Boeing in Seattle and one from de Havilland in Montreal. And went down to the travel store and found out that it was 8 pounds cheaper to fly a 1-year-old and him and my mom to Montreal. So that's how we decided to immigrate to Montreal. But listen, I think education's always been really important to me. And growing up in Canada, there's access to what I would say very good kind of commercial grade education all the way through university. It's very much subsidized by the government, and I always feel very fortunate to be in places like this to share ideas with incredible people like yourself and many others here in the room. So started in tech 30 years ago and stayed in tech that whole time. I just found the changes fascinating to me, how quickly things move, and whether it's here in global government or global enterprise, it's interesting to find the challenges often run very much parallel. And I know we like to think, the federal government is different, but it's not all that different in the long run.
Which leads me to my next question. So, we all know the federal government sits on mountains and mountains of data, but it doesn't leverage the data very well to actually inform decision making. The Congress, in its wisdom, actually put a statutory requirement in place about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago to require chief data officers in each agency. This is just the early stages of a sort of a 10-year data-driven strategy, federal data strategy. But, to your point about the government not being so different from large corporations, I'd love to draw you out on what are you seeing as best practices in large companies that actually might help the federal government sort of accelerate its journey, its data journey, if you will.
Well, great question. And the federal government, in and of itself, I think, is one of the largest enterprises in the world. There's a couple of million civilian workers. There's a couple of million patriots that serve our country in the military, and probably another million people that are civilian and working in the DoD, and I think they're struggling with the volumes of data that swirls around the enterprise. I think Phillips 66, their CEO, said data is the new oil, and I think he was really serious, right? And every government worker has had to deal with decades of kind of technical debt of manual business process work to get a task done. And over time, they've overlaid that with software. Microsoft Excel is a great example, 30-plus-year-old piece of software. It automates some of the work, but still much of that manual work is really placing data into spreadsheet cells. And that's not too different than many of the largest insurance companies or banks that I talk to. Their CEOs still shake their heads around how much of the closing of a quarter, for example, is done in Excel. And so I like to think of it as a journey, Michelle, and I think everyone's on a journey, and the government's no different. I think one thing that might be a little different about this era of technology, especially with generative AI, is the opportunity to make a leaps and bounds improvement in how we get things done in government is very much there. And it's not so much about deploying the right piece of software, but it's investing in your people so that they can leverage the right tools, whatever they be, and learn the technology that is either available or soon to be available.
Yeah. So are there, as you think about like some of your more successful clients or customers, what are some of the key lessons that you'd pull out of their experience that might be useful for a federal government that maybe is a little bit farther, an agency that's farther behind on the journey?
Well, it's invest in your people and provide them with the upskilling opportunities. For example, Alteryx makes a piece of software called Designer that allows for a spreadsheet jockey, if you will, to become, deliver the output of more of a citizen data scientist. And that really requires just an ongoing investment, not just the training. It only takes a couple of weeks of training, but creating like an internal community, and what a community that would be, of millions of people that work for this government, but an internal community that properly rewards the right kind of activities and behaviors. And so when you build a workflow and you can publish that workflow to hundreds or thousands of different colleagues, being able to share data and allow for proper guardrails and securitization of that data, but being able to share data so that you can automate and make really proper data-driven decisions much faster. And then, what some of my favorite companies do is within that community, they gamify. They give away, rewards to people that are the most productive, that build the most workflows, or they celebrate successes of, this workflow saved thousands of man hours by being able to replace what took just thousands of man hours and putting data into cells and spreadsheets into a workflow that can be published and automated.
Yeah, it's such an important insight because so often we, sort of put the policy in place, set the requirement. We may train people sometimes in the federal government, but your idea about rewarding changes of behavior, it's that changing the incentive structure to get the new behavior is so critical. I remember when I was undersecretary, we put a big emphasis on a human capital strategy. We wanted to get everybody to training, and I got lots of supervisors saying, yes, ma'am, training's very important, but I got no training requests, right. to approve. And it finally dawned on me that I had to actually make it part of their performance evaluation. You have to get this percentage of your people to training, and then suddenly my office was flooded with training requests because you change the incentive. So I think that is really important. Just to double click a little bit more on this, do you also find are people as people get more data skilled, does it change their career path at all?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, if you think about, we've all been there with manual software, but you think about the drudgery of pulling data from different sources and putting it into the right format, of right columns and rows. I've heard a woman that's a customer from one of the big banks calls it soul-crushing work. Yeah. And it's not fun, right? Yeah. And so when you take those people out of that work and you put them into a community, whether it's within their company or the Alteryx community of citizen data scientists, their disposition brightens, let's just say, and they love to share how they've solved problems with others. I mean, I've even been on our community site looking at somebody from JP Morgan sharing a workflow idea with somebody from Goldman Sachs, two competing banks, and they're sharing things for the greater good, right? And so these people become. I'll tell you two things that I really notice. One is the attrition levels of these kinds of workers at companies goes down dramatically, upwards of 50%. And then I think the upward mobility of these people, especially, we're still in the early innings of this automation journey. Generative AI is still brand new and not really yet deployed in most enterprises. So I think there's still a long way to go here, and my guess is these people will end up running organizations because I think Victoria put it very succinctly. Every company thinks they're a tech company these days. It's because they are. They're trying to automate and digitize everything that they do so that they can be the very best that they need to be for their customers.
Yeah, you mentioned generative AI, and AI, discussion of AI is, it's in every conversation, it seems, at this point. The National AI Advisory Commission just put out its first annual report that, again, focused on the issue of an AI-skilled workforce, which sounds pretty intimidating to a lot of people. So as you think about a data-ready workforce and then an AI-ready workforce, how do you think about that? And I know my understanding is that Alteryx uses very low-code or no-code tools. Yep. So someone like me who would be very intimidated by trying to do anything with AI other than use it, you actually kind of bridge that gap for people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think to have, AI is obviously an extraordinary buzzword right now. I can only categorize what's happening with investors as like a frenzy. They assume that either you're going to be put out of business by generative AI or, because very similar to what, in the 2000, right at the turn of the century, they said that software was going to eat the world. And, generative AI is really very much dependent upon the data and the people that you train it with, right? And so you have to have good data going in to have good data going out. So, there's the horror stories that we read about in the New York Times about a large learning model, an LLM that was trained with some fiction, and it let its imagination run wild. And so for me, I think if you're going to start to leverage these kinds of capabilities in the government or at an enterprise, you've got to really have a skilled workforce that knows how to train these large language models and knows how to be able to move from manual work to automated work with a low-code, no-code piece of software like Alteryx Designer. Really being able to start to harness and put the data into the form factor that it needs to be in to be able to apply more analytics against it. And so artificial intelligence is truly artificial until you apply the right data to it and you apply the right people training those large learning models.
Yeah, the human judgment to actually train the model. So you mentioned an example of two large banks who are competitors sharing workflow best practices. So, the federal government is not known for its information sharing best practices. Information tends to be very siloed for many people. There's an incentive to control it's my information, and controlling access to that information actually gives me status or position or power. We learned some hard lessons about that after 9/11, and there was certainly a big push in the counterterrorism domain to really get agencies sharing the different pieces of the puzzle so we could get the bigger picture and actually prevent attacks. But I would say that's sort of still the exception, not the rule, and that data is still very much stuck in silos, often deep kind of inside legacy systems, as you said, in formats that are sort of certainly not universal or common. And so, and there's a trust issue about sharing information. So again, I'd just like to draw you out from that siloed information. And, if you're in a large company, for example, where there's a trust issue about why should I share my information, how do you work with people to tackle that?
Yeah, well, it definitely is work. And I'll tell you, the last time I was in the Beltway, I hosted a luncheon with a handful of chief data officers from the civilian agencies. And frankly, I fell in love with both of these guys. They were both extraordinarily bright, and the fact that they're working for the government, dedicating their output to our country, I was really supercharged by my interaction with them. I put them up against any CDO that I've met in the private sector, to be frank with you. But I think trust is a really big thing. You've got to have certainly have the right sort of guardrails up to be able to start sharing the data. But the technology exists today, and it's it really is about embracing modern technology in the form factors that it is allowed to exist in public sector. So working with the right systems integrators to be able to bring the right enablement of the employees and bring the right toolkit to the agencies. I mean, I'll tell you what doesn't work. It doesn't work when you bring in a large army of people as a let's say a provider, a software provider to a company, move out all the employees and say, let us take over and have them run it all, because that can only be a short-term solution. I think that would be in the best interests of our country. I think truly upskilling the people and allowing them to leverage the technology that's out there, and then having the right governance and oversight that is necessary in any environment, whether it's a large bank or a government entity.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, in some ways, you're not only, you're not just a tech company providing a product. You are actually hands-on doing a lot of capacity building.
Right.
Right. And I assume that's not just at the beginning, like the initial training, but how does that develop over time as the workforce uses the product more and more and gets more data savvy?
Yeah, I think you can. It's a continuum in my mind that should never end. I think you can continue to, train the large language models with better and better data to make more and more refined decisions that allow for the ultimate optimization of almost every sort of every project workflow in a business or a government.
Yeah. The other thing I've seen is, in the federal government in particular, is this sense of it's a little bit of the perfect is the enemy of the good. Like,
yeah.
We have these legacy old computers and software. We're not in the cloud. Our data's a mess. We're just not ready. We have to do all these things before we can actually start using data and upskilling our workforce to make data-informed decisions. I'm sure you've encountered that in some of your companies as well. How do you kind of, how do you get beyond that mindset? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think scale is the enemy as well, right? And so it's, I think some wise person in India said you can't eat an elephant all at once, right? You really start with small achievable projects and then build upon the success of them, and that not only allows you to start building some internal wins, but it also just demonstrates to the people that it's achievable and doable.
Yeah.
And really just having a good project plan to continue to expand that. And really the way this technology is moving, I think it'll be a virtuous cycle where you're always going to be improving and iterating and adapting.
Yeah. So in some ways it's like, rather than typically, at least speaking, one of my experience in the DoD is everything is this like top-down layered plan and it sort of cascades down. What you're saying is it's actually you find some champions or at least somebody who's willing to lean forward and take the risk of trying something different. Right. You kind of create some, examples of success, and then you start, proliferating that within the organization, and then, hopefully another organization looks over and says, "Hey, what are you doing over there?
Right.
And I want some of that." And so is that sort of it's
absolutely,
yeah.
and as a partner or a supplier to business or government, it's you want to share these successes, but they're always better when they're shared internally. They seem to go farther and speak a lot more, more loudly. And then and only then do you really earn permission to do more. And what I found, I won't name the large bank, but it's a large Asia Pacific bank. They started with a small working group of 50 people on some specific projects within the office of the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. And it was a 3-month proof of concept. By the time we'd finished that, 600 people had applied for the next phase.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And these were people from all different walks of life in this bank, from all around the Asia Pacific world. It was fascinating to see, and we just kept building on that success. And in particular, this bank did a really good job of creating a real positive internal community around success.
Yeah.
And they trumpeted wins. They talked about things that went wrong and what they learned from it. And, it's what I think any good business or government agency would do.
Yeah, great. Well, I think you've helped set the table for the day by putting lots of good ideas on the table. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Mark Anderson,
Thank you very much. Yeah,
CEO of Alteryx.